There is a quiet assumption many people carry without ever quite noticing it. The assumption that somewhere beneath the surface of our thoughts, beneath our moods, beneath our reactions, there is a solid version of ourselves that ought to be visible. And that if it is not visible, if it feels blurred or unstable, then something must be wrong. Social anxiety often grows out of this assumption, though it rarely announces itself in such a tidy way. It simply feels like uncertainty, like standing in a room full of people and sensing that you are slightly unfinished, slightly out of focus, as if everyone else arrived with a clear outline and you arrived mid-sentence. What makes this interesting is that nothing in ordinary life behaves the way we expect ourselves to behave. A river does not pause to decide which shape it should take before moving forward. A flame does not stop to question whether it is flickering correctly. Even a cat, sitting in the middle of a room, does not appear to wonder how it is being perceived. It simply sits, and yet the human mind, placed in a social setting, often begins to act as though it must justify its own existence in real time, as though it must explain itself before it is allowed to be present. This is where the mind invents a peculiar task for itself. It decides that interaction is not merely interaction, but a performance whose meaning must be constantly monitored. Every word becomes evidence. Every pause becomes a signal. Every facial expression becomes a mirror held up to the question, is this who I am? And notice how subtle this is. The anxiety is not only about what others think, it is about what their reactions might reveal about you to yourself. The room becomes less a place of shared experience and more a testing ground for identity. Imagine, for a moment, a mirror that does not reflect light but reacts emotionally. Each time you speak, it shifts. Each time someone looks away, it distorts. Each time there is silence, it cracks slightly. Now imagine trying to use that mirror to understand your own face. This is the strange mirror social anxiety places in front of the mind. It asks you to discover who you are by watching how unstable reflections respond to you. And because the reflections are never consistent, the conclusion is always uncertain. Overthinking emerges not because the mind is broken, but because it is trying to solve a problem that cannot be solved in the way it has framed it. The question, who am I being right now, sounds reasonable on the surface. But it assumes that identity is something that can be captured in a single moment, frozen long enough to be evaluated. It assumes that the self is an object rather than an activity. And once this assumption takes hold, every interaction feels like a high-stakes experiment, where the data must be collected quickly before the moment disappears. What is rarely noticed is how rigid this framing becomes. The mind begins to narrow its focus. Instead of experiencing conversation, it watches itself having one. Instead of listening, it listens to itself listening. Instead of laughing, it checks whether the laughter sounded natural. Identity hardens into a role that must be maintained, defended, adjusted. And the more effort is poured into maintaining it, the more fragile it feels. Like gripping water in your hand, tightening your fingers only ensures that less remains. This tension does not announce itself dramatically. It appears as small hesitations, as mental rehearsals before speaking, as a quiet sense of being slightly late to your own life. Time feels compressed. Moments feel evaluated before they are lived. And beneath it all sits a curious fear, not always conscious, that if the monitoring stops, something undefined might collapse. As though without constant self-examination, the self itself would vanish. Yet notice how this anxiety is inseparable from a deep seriousness about identity. The belief that who you are must be coherent, consistent, legible. That you must be someone in particular in order to be allowed into the flow of interaction. The irony is that this seriousness creates the very distance it is trying to eliminate. By standing outside the moment to analyze it, the mind removes itself from the simple fact of being there. And being there, without commentary, begins to feel unfamiliar. Everyday life offers countless quiet examples of this. Sitting at a table while conversation moves effortlessly around you. walking away from an interaction replaying fragments of what you said, not to remember them, but to measure them. Lying awake at night, reconstructing a version of yourself based on how the day seemed to go. None of this feels philosophical while it is happening. It feels practical, necessary. As though vigilance were the price of belonging. But perhaps what is being protected here is not belonging at all, but an image of the self that believes it must be protected in the first place. A self that exists slightly ahead of experience, judging it before it unfolds. And once this image takes center stage, the mind begins to orbit around it endlessly, mistaking movement for progress, analysis for understanding. There is something gently revealing in noticing this pattern without trying to fix it. Simply seeing how the question, "Who am I right now?" keeps returning, not because it needs an answer, but because it has been framed as a problem. And problems invite tension. They invite effort. They invite the sense that resolution lies somewhere just beyond the next thought. So the mind keeps thinking, keeps watching, keeps tightening its grip on identity, hoping clarity will appear if it looks closely enough. And in doing so, it overlooks something quietly obvious, something so ordinary that it rarely feels worth mentioning. The fact that experience is already happening, long before it is interpreted. That presence does not wait for a definition. That you were already here before the question began. What is curious is how quickly the mind forgets that it learned this habit. Overthinking does not arrive fully formed. It grows quietly, almost politely, out of repeated moments where attention turns back on itself. Perhaps there was a time when you noticed a reaction, a raised eyebrow, a pause, a laugh that came a little too late, and something inside tightened. Not dramatically, just enough to register that social space can feel uncertain. From there, the mind does what it is very good at doing. It tries to prepare. Preparation sounds harmless, sensible even. But here preparation slowly transforms into surveillance. The mind begins to hover over itself, like a security camera installed inside the skull. Not because there is danger, but because there might be. And once this camera is running, it starts recording everything. Tone of voice, timing, body language, the feeling of speaking, the feeling of being seen while speaking. Identity is no longer something lived through. It becomes footage to be reviewed later. Notice how different this is from how we relate to most ordinary activities. When you walk down a street, you do not usually ask whether you are walking correctly. When you breathe, you do not check whether your breathing aligns with who you are. These actions flow because they are not burdened with the task of self-definition. But social interaction, under the lens of anxiety, is asked to carry an extra weight. It must say something not only about what is happening, but about what kind of person is happening. The metaphor begins to deepen here. Imagine trying to hear music while simultaneously analyzing the waveform of the sound. The more attention you give to the shape of the sound, the less you hear the music itself. Social anxiety functions in much the same way. Attention splits. Part of it remains in the conversation. Another part steps back to observe the self participating in the conversation. And the second part gradually becomes louder, more insistent, until it dominates the experience. This is where identity subtly hardens. Instead of being something fluid, responsive, and contextual, it begins to feel like a fragile structure that must be maintained across situations. You are no longer just speaking. You are being someone who speaks this way. You are no longer just quiet. You are the quiet one. Each interaction leaves behind a residue, a story about who you are, and the mind begins to carry these stories forward, stacking them into a narrative that feels increasingly heavy. The tension does not come from social situations themselves, but from the effort to remain consistent with this narrative. Consistency becomes a silent demand. If you were confident yesterday, why did you hesitate today? If you were funny in one room, why did you feel flat in another? The mind treats these variations as failures rather than as evidence of something deeply ordinary. That identity shifts with context because it is not a fixed object. Time plays an interesting role here. In moments of anxiety, time collapses inward. The present moment feels crowded, packed with significance. A single sentence feels as though it must represent you entirely, and because the moment feels so dense, the mind rushes to interpret it before it has even finished unfolding. Reflection moves faster than experience. Meaning arrives before sensation has settled. This creates a peculiar exhaustion, not physical, but cognitive. A tiredness that comes from carrying yourself as a project. From feeling that you are always slightly behind, always catching up to the person you are supposed to be. Social spaces then feel less like places of shared presence and more like exams taken without clear instructions. You leave them not necessarily because something went wrong, but because the effort of maintaining coherence has quietly drained you. And yet, underneath all of this, something remains remarkably unchanged. The simple fact of being aware. The noticing of thoughts, reactions, sensations. Even the anxiety itself is noticed. This awareness does not appear anxious. It does not seem confused about who it is. It simply registers what is happening, but because attention has been trained to look for answers rather than to notice experience, this quieter layer is often overlooked. So the mind keeps circling the same question: who am I in this moment? And because the question is asked from within tension, it never quite settles. Each answer generates another doubt. Each interpretation opens the door to another interpretation. Overthinking is not excessive thought. It is thought trapped in a loop that believes resolution lies one more turn ahead. Everyday life continues alongside this loop. People talk, time passes, work gets done, meals are eaten, and within all of it, the mind maintains its watch, scanning for signs that confirm or contradict the story it is trying to hold together. It is a strange way of living, not fully absent, but rarely fully present either. Perhaps what has been overlooked is not a missing skill or a broken trait, but a simple confusion about where identity actually lives. Treated as an object to be observed, it becomes slippery. Treated as a story to be maintained, it becomes exhausting. And the more effort invested in pinning it down, the more elusive it seems, so the watching continues. The checking, the replaying, not out of vanity, but out of a sincere desire to understand oneself. And yet the understanding remains just out of reach, not because it is hidden, but because it is being sought in reflections rather than in the movement of experience itself. There is a subtle shift that happens when the mind becomes accustomed to watching itself. The watcher begins to feel more real than what is being watched. The commentary starts to outweigh the experience. And gradually, without any deliberate decision, life is lived one step removed, as though presence itself needed permission from analysis before it could unfold. Social anxiety thrives in this space between experience and commentary, because it convinces the mind that observation is safety. At this point, identity is no longer something that emerges naturally from interaction. It becomes something assembled retroactively. After a conversation ends, the mind reconstructs it like a scene from a film, editing, zooming in, replaying lines. Not to enjoy the memory, but to extract information. What did that silence mean? Why did that laugh feel forced? What does that say about me? The event itself is already over, but the self that is being evaluated lingers, suspended in interpretation. This is where rigidity deepens. The mind begins to believe that there is a correct way to exist socially, and that deviation from it reveals a flaw in character rather than a fluctuation in mood, context, or energy. Identity becomes moralized. You are not just awkward in a moment, you are awkward. You are not just uncertain, you are uncertain as a person. And once these labels solidify, the mind treats them as facts rather than temporary descriptions. The strange thing is that this rigidity coexists with a constant sense of instability. The more fixed the identity feels, the more anxious it becomes about being disrupted. Like a house of cards that looks symmetrical from a distance, but trembles at the slightest breeze. Every new interaction carries the possibility of collapse, and so the mind tightens its control, believing that vigilance will prevent disorder, even as vigilance itself becomes the source of strain. This tension often disguises itself as self-awareness. It feels mature to analyze oneself, responsible, thoughtful. But there is a difference between awareness and fixation. Awareness moves with experience. Fixation freezes it. Social anxiety encourages fixation by insisting that the self must be understood before it can be expressed, that you must know who you are before you can show up. And this condition is never met, because knowing is always delayed until after the moment has passed. Notice how this affects ordinary interactions. A simple greeting feels loaded. A casual comment feels revealing. Silence feels meaningful rather than neutral. The mind reads between lines that may not exist, and because it is reading itself at the same time, the sense of being observed intensifies. You are not only in the room, you are also watching yourself in the room, imagining how the room sees you. This double position is exhausting. It splits attention. Part of you is present, responding naturally. Another part is detached, scoring the performance. And because these two parts are never fully synchronized, there is a constant feeling of being slightly off, slightly delayed, slightly artificial. The irony is that this artificiality is not coming from the self, but from the attempt to monitor the self while it is unfolding. Everyday life offers countless moments where this tension quietly asserts itself. Sitting in a meeting, aware not only of the discussion but of how attentive you appear. Laughing at a joke while wondering whether the timing was right. Choosing words carefully, not to communicate, but to avoid misrepresenting who you think you are. Over time, communication becomes cautious. Spontaneity feels risky. Silence feels safer, though it carries its own interpretations. And yet, beneath all of this, something remains remarkably consistent. The flow of sensations. The sound of voices. The feeling of the body in space. These elements do not appear anxious. They do not question themselves. They simply occur. But because the mind has learned to privilege interpretation over sensation, this layer of experience is rarely given authority. It is treated as raw material for analysis rather than as experience in its own right. The loop tightens here. The more the mind analyzes, the more distant presence feels. The more distant presence feels, the more the mind believes analysis is necessary to compensate. Social anxiety feeds on this circular logic. It does not shout, it whispers. It suggests that one more insight, one more correction, one more adjustment will finally bring coherence. And so the mind continues, sincerely, tirelessly, trying to arrive somewhere it already is. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of this process is how impersonal it actually is. It feels deeply personal, because it revolves around the idea of me. But the pattern itself is mechanical. Attention turning inward, thought evaluating thought, identity solidifying around interpretations. None of this requires a defective personality. It arises naturally when awareness becomes preoccupied with itself. So the tension persists, not as a dramatic crisis, but as a low-grade hum beneath social life, a sense of being slightly misaligned with the moment, of watching life rather than inhabiting it fully. And because this hum becomes familiar, it begins to feel like who you are, rather than something that is happening. And this is perhaps where the deepest confusion lies, mistaking a pattern of attention for an identity, mistaking a habit of monitoring for a description of the self. Once this confusion takes hold, overthinking no longer feels like an activity. It feels like a trait, something inherent, something permanent. Yet even this belief is simply another thought passing through awareness, another interpretation layered on top of experience. It feels solid only because it is repeated. It feels convincing only because it is familiar. And familiarity, as the mind well knows, can masquerade as truth. There is something quietly revealing in noticing how much effort goes into holding an idea of oneself together. The effort is rarely dramatic. It is subtle, almost polite. a tightening of attention, a quick internal adjustment, a moment of self-correction that happens so fast it feels invisible. And yet these moments accumulate. They form a posture the mind takes toward itself, a stance of continual evaluation that slowly begins to feel like the background of life. What is being evaluated, though, is not experience itself, but a representation of it. A version of you constructed from memory, expectation, and imagined perception. This version is always slightly behind the moment, because it is assembled after the fact, and yet it is treated as if it must guide the moment before it happens. This creates a strange inversion. Life becomes something that must conform to an idea, rather than the idea emerging from life. Social anxiety intensifies this inversion because it places identity under a spotlight. It suggests that who you are is on display, constantly, and that this display must be managed. The result is a persistent self-consciousness that feels like depth, but functions more like distance. You are close to yourself, but not intimate. You know many things about yourself, but you are rarely resting in what is happening. And notice how this affects the sense of time. Moments feel brief, slippery. They pass before you have fully entered them. Reflection arrives too early, as if the mind is anxious not to miss anything important about itself. The present becomes a corridor you hurry through on your way to understanding, and understanding, in turn, is always postponed to the next quiet moment, the next replay, the next thought. This is why overthinking feels endless. It is not moving toward resolution. It is maintaining orientation. It keeps the mind pointed toward an image of itself, circling it, adjusting it, refining it. The loop persists not because the answer is missing, but because the question has been given too much authority. Who am I being right now? Becomes the lens through which everything is filtered, even when nothing requires filtering. In ordinary life, this shows up in small, familiar ways. Feeling relief when a conversation ends, not because it was unpleasant, but because the monitoring can pause. Feeling more at ease alone, not because solitude is inherently better, but because the mirror has been set down. Feeling briefly present when absorbed in an activity, only to notice presence dissolving the moment it is named. These are not failures of character. They are clues about where attention has been trained to rest. There is no dramatic shift here, no revelation that suddenly dissolves the tension. What appears instead is a quiet recognition that identity feels heavy when it is treated as something that must be carried, that the self becomes confusing when it is asked to explain itself constantly. That anxiety emerges not from interaction, but from the attempt to stabilize something that is naturally fluid. And perhaps this is why moments of ease often arrive unexpectedly. In laughter that catches you off guard, in a conversation where you forget to watch yourself, in a simple task that absorbs attention without commentary. In these moments, identity does not disappear. It simply stops being a problem. It functions without being inspected. It moves without being defined. Nothing special happens. There is no announcement, no sense of achievement, just a brief return to the ordinary fact of being here, engaged, responsive, unedited. And when the mind later notices this and tries to understand it, the distance returns. Not because something was lost, but because attention has shifted back to representation. So the cycle continues. Awareness noticing thought, thought commenting on awareness, identity forming around the commentary, anxiety tightening around the identity. This is not a personal flaw. It is a pattern the mind falls into when it mistakes self-observation for self-knowledge. Perhaps the softest shift available is not in changing the pattern, but in seeing it as a pattern rather than as a definition. Seeing how overthinking arises, how it sustains itself, how it feeds on seriousness. And seeing, too, that experience does not wait for permission from identity to occur. It unfolds regardless. It always has. The room is still there. The voices still sound. The body still breathes. Life continues at its own pace, indifferent to the story being told about it. And within this ongoing movement, the question of who you are loosens its grip, not because it has been answered, but because it no longer needs to be asked quite so urgently. Nothing has been fixed, nothing has been resolved, but something subtle has shifted in orientation, from watching life to noticing that watching is happening, from trying to arrive at yourself to recognizing that you never actually left.